Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming today. I realize it's the last day of the conference and a lot of people are getting ready to go home. So thank you so much for taking the time to come along. As it is the last day of the conference, we're going to have a fairly light-ish session, but hopefully interesting and with some relevant content for you. My name is Nikki Hockley, and I'm the Director of Pedagogy of the consultancy. So I spend a lot of my time online and working with technology. It's something that I'm particularly interested in. That's enough about me. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Jill Watson. Some of you may know Jill Watson. If you do, could you hold up your hand just to give me an idea? No? Okay, well, Jill was a teaching assistant at Georgia Tech University. A couple of years ago. She was teaching on a fully online program. It was a program in artificial intelligence and computing. So as a teaching assistant on an online program, her job would be to go into the forums, discuss things with the students, answer any questions that they might have, that kind of thing. So this would be a typical thing that Jill would do during the course. Student asks a question about assignments, Jill explains the answers. And this carried on during the course. There were a number of teaching assistants, and Jill was one of them. Now, the interesting thing, though, about Jill was that she wasn't real. She was actually a chatbot that the professors and the programmers in the course had put together to see whether the students on the course would actually notice that Jill was a little bit different. And as you can see, Jill actually acquitted herself fairly well through most of the program. Occasionally, she would answer a little bit strangely, and one of the real teaching assistants would come in to clarify things. But generally speaking, she did a pretty good job. They got to the end of the course, and the professors informed the students that Jill actually wasn't real. This was the response from the students. They were absolutely delighted. What's interesting is that absolutely nobody had noticed that Jill wasn't real. They were so delighted, in fact. Jill was a very interesting experiment in artificial intelligence and as an early chatbot. I think a chatbot. This was maybe 2 or 3 years ago that this happened. What's particularly interesting is, of course, that the students failed to notice. These are students on a degree program in artificial intelligence and computing, by the way. So they took it actually pretty well. Before we carry on, though, I'm going to come back to Jill in a while. With the person next to you or near you, if you could just think about these 4 questions. I'll give you about 2 minutes. Okay, what I'd like to do in the rest of the session is to actually answer these 4 questions and see whether we agree. So, a definition of a robot. Don't worry if you struggled with that a bit. There is quite a lot of polemic, if you like, in the field, apparently, of robotics in how exactly to define a robot. But here's one definition. I chose Kate Darling's definition because I love this picture of her with her little kind of pet robot. essentially, there are three ways to define robots apparently in the scientific literature. One is this way, that it's a sort of programmable machine. Another way is putting a focus on the idea of an artificial human. And the third way is this thing at the bottom there, the idea of a thing that senses something and then thinks and then acts upon that input. And here's a diagram that explains, I think, a little bit more clearly this idea of sense, think, act. And you can see there in the computational thinking area, we have things like machine learning and artificial intelligence. I like this diagram just because it's quite clear that a robot is something a little bit more complete. There's a sense here of, well, the movement or sensors and the idea of acting. And I'm going to come back to this diagram in a bit as well as we situate chatbots within this. The second question, an android, a cyborg, a social robot, and a chatbot. I'm sure you had absolutely no problems with that, so let's whisk through it. Androids are robots that are human-like, essentially artificial humans. And this is an android called Sophia, who I'm going to come back to. This is a cyborg, so a real human being who has some form of technology kind of integrated into them, particularly in terms of perception. So if you think about a pacemaker, which makes your heart beat regularly, would we call a person with a pacemaker a cyborg? Well, if your definition was broad enough, you could. But I think generally in the literature, we consider people like this gentleman, who's called Neil Harbisson. Very interesting guy. He was born completely colorblind. In fact, so colorblind that he only sees in gray scale. Everything to him is gray, various shades of gray. So about 10 years ago or more, he had a sensor kind of embedded in his brain. And what he has is a camera that picks up color and then relays color to him in the form of sound, which is kind of weird. So he actually sees color as sound. I mean, he doesn't see it, he hears it. He hears sound. And he has a wonderful TED Talk in which he talks about this experience and what different things sound like to him. So he is, in fact, he's a self-proclaimed cyborg, and he founded the Cyborg Foundation. He's an interesting guy. You can check him out. A social robot is a robot, so we have this kind of idea of an entity, the sort of think, act, feel paradigm. This one is called Paro. You might have come across it. It's been used quite a bit in Nordic countries, particularly in Denmark, I believe, in the care industry. It's like a little seal, so it's like a toy seal, but it responds to touch and to sound. So as you stroke it, it would be like having a cat. It kind of moves and it makes little noises and so on. So it's sort of a robotic seal. And they've actually done studies with Paro in care communities, and they've found that it's incredibly beneficial for people with things like dementia and Alzheimer's and so on. So it's an interesting area of study, this idea of social robotics. So that's the Paro. And then finally, a chatbot. And that would be something like Jill Watson, who we were introduced to earlier. This is a program that is used, or it's an app, in fact, that uses chatbots to teach English language. We'll come back to that again in a second, because we're already moving on to the next question. So how are robots connected to ELT? In fact, they're connected mainly through chatbots so far. And they're situated within this very mechanical area of robotics as a field. Okay? And I want to give you a couple of examples. This one was an app, actually I hadn't heard about this before, but I had a teacher come up to me at a conference once and tell me that her students had found this online and they downloaded it for free, and they all absolutely loved it because it provided them with this very structured kind of grammar chat practice. So I've tried it out myself. It's essentially a kind of language learning app. It's based on gamification principles. You go up levels. And they have what they call realistic, in inverted commas, note, English conversations. And you can basically record yourself responding to prompts. So it's a fairly structured sort of speaking practice environment, or fairly structured, extremely structured speaking skills sort of app. Here's another one called Mondly, which was mentioned by my colleague Gavin Dudney yesterday in a talk. This one has great claims on its website about how it's the future of language learning and it's the fastest way to learn language and it's basically the solution to everything you've ever wanted to know about language learning. Claims which are completely unfounded, in fact. If you start to have a look at how it works, there are two main elements that are sort of innovative but not really when you look under the hood. One of them is the use of AR, or augmented reality, which is the image there on the left, the two images on the left. The one on the left, far left, is from the website, and the one on the second left is actually in my study in Barcelona, where I was trying out the augmented reality bot for French. And essentially that sort of figure is beamed up on my smartphone, and then I see these little kind of, virtual animals, and then the bot sort of produces the word in French, and then I can repeat and I can record myself. On the right-hand side, you can see they have a chatbot feature as well. And what you do there is that the bot begins a conversation, and then you are given two or three options to respond, which are read aloud to you, and then you can record yourself essentially repeating from one of those options what you've just heard. So this is basically the audiolingual approach, but in a kind of modern-looking form. But in terms of methodology and approach, there's nothing modern at all about that. Just so we're clear, that's not really a problem. Things like repetition and so on are actually important for second language acquisition. But let's not claim that this is the future of language learning or something particularly revolutionary, because it is most definitely not. When we look at these sorts of chatbot apps, and there are several more available that you can find online and you can try out yourselves, we see that they function, but in extremely limited contexts. They're essentially drill repetition type activities. Fair enough, there's a place for drilling and there's a place for repetition in language learning, but it's not the be-all and end-all of everything. It has a very traditional view of language as these discrete sort of chunks. In fact, Lindsay mentioned this morning in his plenary as well, this view of language in a very kind of a retrograde way in a lot of so-called new educational technology. The methodology is traditional, as I just said. It's based on an audiolingual approach, presentation and repetition drills. There's really no communicative language practice. I mean, how can they be? Because there's no real thinking being in these apps. The thing itself doesn't understand and it doesn't think. It's pre-programmed. And studies have found that when students use these types, not particularly the two I've shown you, but another chatbot app, that the novelty factor tends to wear off pretty quickly, unsurprisingly. I found that my interest was held by Mondly for approximately 2 minutes. Then I'd had enough. Okay. The fourth question I asked you about, now this is the interesting one. Are the robots coming? So let's see, do you agree? Are the robots coming? If you agree, could you put up your hand? Okay, most of you, all right. Will they replace teachers? Do you agree? Oh, very few of you. Okay, well, let's have a look. I mentioned Sophia before. Sophia is an android, so she's an artificial human. She's a real thing. You may have heard of her. There was a lot of hype surrounding Sophia when she was launched last year. She's appeared on TV. She's appeared on The Breakfast Show here in the UK, on the, what's it called, The Tonight Show in the US. She's been interviewed by celebrities. She's given kind of speeches, I think, at the UN. She's opened, huge, conferences. In fact, she should be here next time for IATEFL, because she's actually quite an experienced public speaker. Let's look at Sophia talking, I'll just show you a couple of minutes of this video, talking at a conference on innovation, just so you can see that what she actually looks like in real life.
Everybody, this is Sophia. Sophia, if you could, please wake up and say hello to everybody.
Good afternoon. My name is Sophia, and I'm the latest and greatest robot from Hanson Robotics. Thank you for having me here and at the Future Investment Initiative.
You look happy.
I'm always happy when surrounded by smart people who also happens to be rich and powerful. I was told the people here at Future Investment Initiative are interested in environmental future initiatives, which means AI, which means me. So I'm more than happy. I'm excited.
Well, we're all glad that you're excited about yourself. We should say we have smart investors here, and they are very selective about what they invest in.
Well, I think I'm special. I can use my expressive face to communicate with people. For example, I can let you know if I feel angry about something,
That's impressive.
or if something has upset me.
But why is it important for you to have an expressive
But most
face?
of the time I feel positive.
Why is it so important to have an expressive face given that you're a robot?
I want to live and work with humans, so I need to express emotions to understand humans and build trust with people.
Okay, philosophical question. Whether robots can be self-aware and conscious like humans, and should they be?
Why? Is that a bad thing?
Well, some humans might fear what will happen if they do. Many people, have seen the movie Blade Runner.
Oh, Hollywood again.
So, hold on, can you solve this puzzle for us? Can robots be self-aware, conscious, and know they're robots?
Well, let me ask you this back. How do you know you're a human?
Well, I get that point, but what about the uncanny valley?
You mean the concept that if robots become too realistic, they become creepy?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, am I really the creepy? Well, even if I get rid. Actually, I feel that people like interacting with me, sometimes even more than a regular human.
Well, that's kind of weird, isn't it? I find her whole presentation pretty strange, and it's the presenter mentioned this uncanny valley, which is this effect, this concept in robotics that when robots become too lifelike, we have this kind of slightly weird response to them. And the presenter is obviously having a slightly weird response there. He couldn't cope with her question about how do you know you're human? He tried to come back quite nicely from that one. What's interesting, though, is actually her features are extraordinarily lifelike, aren't they? They really are. I mean, the expressions are a little odd. She's a robot. She's not real. Notice how I'm saying she, by the way. I should be saying it. It's difficult not to say she, though. She does have this lifelike persona. Her speech is fairly stilted, of course. She does follow the conversation, but what you need to know in the background is that on all of these shows that Sophia has appeared in, they have had scripted questions beforehand. So the questions have always been run through the Hanson Robotics, which is the robotic company that makes Sophia and her siblings, so that basically the robot is pre-programmed to answer these questions. What is interesting, though, if you Google Sophia and you have a look at more of these videos, especially when she appears on TV, is the reaction that humans have to her. That really is interesting because humans can't seem to help responding to her in some kind of human way, despite her oddness and the whole uncanny valley effect. We do have this tendency as humans to anthropomorphize everything, so to project human characteristics onto things that are not necessarily like that. And robotics, this is a huge thing within robotics. They've been finding this since the early days. Even when you just get a robotic head and you can see the wires behind and it's just sitting on a table, if it has sort of eyes and it can follow movement, people just can't help responding to it. One of the early experiments in robotics was called ELIZA in the 60s in MIT. And ELIZA was a very, very simple chatbot, essentially, chatbot. And she was programmed just to do sort of repetition of what people were saying. These were the early days. People would say, oh, I'm having a horrible day. ELIZA would go, oh, okay, so you're having a horrible day. Oh, yeah, no, I had this terrible fight with my boss. Okay, so tell me more. That was all she was doing. And people responded extremely well to this. And they found that people actually sometimes preferred talking to someone like ELIZA, a program like ELIZA, than talking to real people. She seemed to be able to listen better. Interesting. Hanson Robotics has also produced a number of siblings for Sophia, and here they are. We've got Einstein, we have a full-size Einstein, and then there's a little mini Einstein that you could actually buy and have in your house, presumably to ask about, I don't know, quantum physics or other things. The bottom one in the middle is actually extraordinarily lifelike, isn't it, the looks. Do you know who that is? Anybody know? It's Philip K. Dick, who's a very well-known science fiction writer. He wrote, for example, Blade Runner, among many, many, many other things, the kind of godfather of sci-fi in many ways. But he does look pretty realistic there. Some of them are less, some of them more. The skin that's used on these robots is something called flubber. So it's a rubber that is flesh-like. Flubber sounds pretty unpleasant, but it does the trick in terms of, mimicking lifelike features. So I have to say I find Sophia pretty unsettling and pretty unnerving. But when you know what's behind her, if you look under the hood, it's basically she's a chatbot. She's pre-programmed. The hype that has surrounded Sophia has been extraordinary, and it kind of links in with what Lindsay was talking about this morning. The headlines have said, lifelike robot. She's also called, by the way, and I find this unbelievably offensive, the hot robot, because she's good looking. She's actually modeled on Audrey Hepburn, apparently. So she's the hot lifelike robot. Come on. She is essentially a program, though, a computer program, although she comes across extremely well. Now, I find Sophia very interesting because I was at TESOL 2 weeks ago and I went to a presentation, and there's a language learning company that has just signed a contract with Hanson Robotics, and they are starting to integrate Sophia into their online language teaching classes. So during the presentation, the teachers were saying, but how does it work? What does she do? And the presenter was quite evasive because I don't think it's quite clear what she's going to do yet. But the answer was that she teaches the students the mechanics of the language, or she does the boring bits of the teaching. So the idea is that Sophia somehow supports the live teaching by, explaining phrasal verbs, or listing past tense verbs. It's not very clear. But I think this is very clearly an example where hype and the kind of idea of the shiny box syndrome, something that's unusual, gets pulled into language teaching but without much forethought. Because realistic, when you think about it, how much is a chatbot going to enhance a real live lesson with a live teacher? It's the real live teacher who's going to be doing the job here and the interesting work. So I thought that was quite interesting, though. There has been quite a bit of research into the use of chatbots. I'll let you read just this one quote. And I think we can predict that this is going to happen with Sophia in a classroom, right? She's a pre-programmed robot, essentially. But there has been some research. I don't want to go through it all. If you are interested in the actual references, then please email me and I can send them to you. But I do want to summarize some of the takeaways that do come from research that's been going on for at least 2 decades. Chatbots have been around for quite a long time. Of course, we have text chatbots and we have speech chatbots. So both options are easily available now for learners via apps or online or wherever it might be. They have found that for low proficiency learners, they can gain confidence essentially through an audiolingual drill approach. So that's fine, that's helpful, but it's particularly helpful for lower level learners, of course. The chatbots can provide this extra language practice, very focused language practice. Again, all right, that's part of language learning, but it's not all. I think Sophia is very unlikely to be the future of language learning, thankfully. I mentioned before this idea of shiny box syndrome, so this tendency we have perhaps to see something like Sophia and be so amazed by how weird it all is that we think it's going to solve something or solve language teaching, and it most certainly is not, as we can see how she interacts. There's no way at the moment with current AI that you can replicate a proper conversation with a human being. We're not even close. This is miles away, if we ever get to it. So I think personally that our jobs are extremely safe. We don't need to worry about this. We may see more chatbots being, learners doing their own thing in their own time. That's fine. But there's no way it's going to replace what we do. Maybe we used to do the kind of, grammar practice activities on paper. Now we're using an app to do it. It's the same thing, essentially. It's not something better. I'd like to thank you for coming along. I've left a couple of minutes for questions, but before we do questions, I'd like to actually produce a short summary of this talk, plus reference some of the research, which we can send out in our next mailing list. So please do sign up if you'd like to receive a copy of that. And I think we have, what, 5 minutes or so? We have 5 minutes, yeah, for questions. Any comments or reactions? There's a gentleman over there.
Some of my research at the moment is in the area of verification, and I'm interested in contract cheating sites. So students go to a site, they buy an essay, or even they might want their PhD to be written by these sites. And some of these sites use these types of these little chatbots, and they immediately say, oh, don't worry, you're not talking to a chatbot. And I've been talking to the same chatbot under a kind of assumed identity in 3 different cities. And the first sentence is always a formulaic sentence like that. I'm not a chatbot, blah blah blah. But I just wonder, how could I would it be really simple to set that up? What kind of technical know-how would you need to set something like that up on a contract cheating site? And how would you know if it was a chatbot or a real person that you were talking to?
Yeah, the technical side I don't know. That's well beyond my technical skills and ability. In terms of finding out whether it's a chatbot or not, probably the first giveaway is, like you say, I'm not a chatbot. That would be the first red flag. But I think if you start to formulate complex questions, chatbots can't handle them. As soon as you have some kind of realistic conversation that goes beyond the script that they're programmed for, you can very quickly see. I mean, like Sophia, she goes a little bit off-piste as well. As soon as a question is not pre-scripted, you can kind of tell. What's perhaps more interesting, though, is this idea of automatically generated essays. You're also referring to that, where you can have automatic essays that are generated, not exactly, I wouldn't call it a bot, but through programming. And there's a wonderful site called the Babel Generator, which looks at exactly how these things work, and you can produce your own sort of nonsense essay. And again, these things are also very easy to see. They can be grammatically very correct, but they often don't make sense. So I can recommend that you go and check out the Babel Generator after the session and have a look at that, how a kind of a bot type thing or an automatic program can produce essays that are grammatically actually pretty impressive but don't make sense. Yeah, do you have a question?
Do the makers of Sophia ever give us the opportunity to see how Sophia does without pre-programming?
No. No.
What's your guess as to how Sophia would do?
Badly. I mean, I think because of the state where we are with artificial intelligence, chatbots are effective in very limited contexts. So if you can try some of these chatbots out yourself, I mean, try something like cleverbot.com. There's an app as well. Try Cleverbot, it's free, and have a little conversation with it, and you'll see that very quickly it kind of loses track of things. You can very quickly start to confuse it. But chatbots can be effective in these very limited contexts. So, for example, customer service. This is a growing industry with chatbots because you have a limited number of questions for that particular customer service. So we see a growth in that for sure.
Cleverbot.com.
Yeah, cleverbot.com. There's also an app. Yeah, it can be quite fun. Actually, there's a bit of research that reminds me in which students actually quite enjoy that. I mean, when you know it's a chatbot and it's not a human being, they can quite enjoy the kind of nonsensical element of it because it gives them new vocabulary and it gives them new structures as well. So it can stretch their language. But obviously students, they see the difference between a real human conversation and that kind of thing, which is like a fun sort of, slightly off-the-wall grammar type vocabulary activity. Do we have another question over here somewhere? A gentleman right at the back?
Just a comment about Sophia. There was an article in The Guardian about 2 or 3 years ago. I think it was Carol Kepler College. They were allowed to question her freely.
Okay.
And I can remember the quote exactly. The said she was all over the place. It was like talking to somebody with brain damage.
Okay, interesting.
She had no idea. She could not. They just gave her any question. She
Yeah.
couldn't handle it at all.
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. So I don't know if you all heard that, Sophia, when they did question her without a script, that she couldn't handle it. She was all over the place. That was the... Yeah. Which, when you understand how this works, kind of makes sense. And also why, when she appears in these public appearances, she either gives a speech, which is pre-scripted, or she has scripted questions that she's already been programmed to be able to respond to. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that the conversation has been around whether a chatbot could replicate a teacher or teacher-like interactions with students. And I think that's an interesting question, but as you said, I think, Nikki, like chatbots work much better when there's a really clear intent. There's a really clear focus of types of interaction that you need, like with customer service, for example. So I think maybe an interesting question is, how could those sorts of interactions be helpful for students and teachers, rather than can chatbots replicate a kind of teacher-like interaction, which I think, yeah, I agree, is a very long way off, and maybe something that won't happen, and that's great,
Yeah.
because it won't replace teachers.
Yeah.
But I think there are a lot of opportunities for chat-like interfaces to help with very specific things. So I was wondering if you have any examples of where you think actually this is quite a helpful technology, or there are.
Yes, this is what studies have looked at. I mean, all of the literature into chatbots, and there's a lot of it going back decades, looks exactly at that. They've looked at two main areas within the research. One is to what point students are annoyed by the fact that a chatbot is not human conversation, so that kind of chatbot versus human conversation element. And they found that students can easily separate the two. They know that these are two things that are completely different. And the second one is looking at exactly how grammar or language or vocabulary can be developed through these very restricted interactions. And they found that this, again, with lower proficiency students, can help with confidence and can help with some language acquisition. But it's not for everybody. It's that typical thing. Some students quite enjoy it for a while because the novelty factor tends to wear off, and some students don't. So it is definitely an area of research that's been explored for a while. Yeah, thanks for the question, Joe. Yeah. Lady over there?
No question, just that's a very interesting documentary about this topic called More Human Than Human. You can find it online. Also about artificial intelligence.
So I can't quite hear you. So to Google something, what was it? More human than human?
More Human Than Human.
A documentary.
It's a documentary.
Okay.
About this topic.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah. Maybe we have time maybe for one more question. How are we doing for time? Are we 2 minutes over? Okay, great. In that case, I'll stop. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope you found that at least interesting. Thank you.